So, hello to everyone. Yeah, that's the sign that we have started. We are, and that's also the sign to shut off your mobile phones. Thank you. We are inaugurating today the annual forum of the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Human Rights and Justice. With us is the president of Tel Aviv University, Professor Ariel Porat, and many, many distinguished guests. May I just recognize one of them, a very special lady. Irwin, I believe you've met. Ariela Cotler, the president of Friends of Tau Canada, who was the energetic spirit behind the establishment of this institute. And one of the flagships of the institute is a fellowship program. So before we are gonna start our presentation, lecture, and panel, I just want to say one thing before the gloom and doom. The idea of the fellowship program is one of them, I would say the flagship of the institute is the fellowship program, and the idea of the fellowship program is to educate and inform young, bright students from many different countries about democracy, human rights, justice, the history of the State of Israel, fighting racism at large, and fighting anti-Semitism specifically. So we are already now at the end of the second year, the second cohort, and while we get a lot of bad news all the time, we also get some good news. So Ariela and I had the pleasure 2 days ago. We got a wonderful email from a student, former student from Norway, from a small town in Norway, who organized a pro-Israel, anti-Semitism rally in a small town in Norway, attended by 500 Norwegians. And in the email he sent us, he said, I want you to know that that's also part of the European reality today. So while he's not here, Nathaniel, I think he deserves a round of applause. And with me are three very distinguished guests. Former Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court, the first Jewish woman to ever serve on that court, the Honorable Rosalie Silberman Abella. The Honorable Irwin Cotler, former Justice Minister of Canada and Attorney General. And he appointed her, as she mentions. In the end, there is a guy out there, yeah. No. But he appointed you only because you really deserved it. That's the thing. And the equally honorable Professor Milette Shamir, Vice President International of Tel Aviv University. Now, today is a special day for one of the four, and that is Justice Abella, because this evening she will become honorary doctorate. She will receive honorary doctorate from this university, and I know this is a very emotional moment for you, although you have quite a few already. And 41, wow. Only 41 to date. And I invite you to give a presentation, short speech, which will be followed by a panel discussion.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I have always felt very lucky to be able to come to Israel and to visit Israel, and never more than now. I have family in the audience, my cousins from Haifa, whom I never get to see and who get the benefit of my one-line emails every once in a while. Thank you for coming. I have friends here, Dan Maridor, Marta Katabia, former Chief Justice of Italy, Michal Wunsch-Cotler, who is the future. So for all of my old friends, cousins, and family, and all of my new friends, cousins, and family. It's a great honor to be here. And because this is an Irwin Cotler Institute, I want to start by saying a few words about Irwin. Irwin has shown that not only can one person make a difference, he can make all the difference in the world. Irwin is what happens when someone with a profound commitment to his Jewishness weaves the visceral influences of its culture and history into a crusade of tolerance for everyone. All of this combines in our polymathic Irwin into a magnificent alchemy of enthusiasm, optimism, generosity, and wisdom. An alchemy stirred with warmth and humility, and using only the finest ingredients. He donates this energetic magic selflessly and brilliantly to everything he does and everyone he loves, turning all of it and all of us into something better than we thought possible. Those of us who have had the privilege of being up close and personal to Irwin Cotler know where he gets the fuel to keep him and the rest of us in perpetual, positive, and joyful motion. Ariella and their wonderful, wonderful kids and grandchildren. Ariella is Irwin's partner, his muse, his most trusted advisor, and his wisest advisor, and the source of his ability to spread the benefits of his preternaturally creative and compassionate brain all over the world. And let's face it, she's also his boss. Irwin's whole life is a monument of optimistic humanism and courageous tenacity, and he's living proof that when the right person is bending it, the long arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. Irwin, thank you for being the illuminated inspiration who helps the rest of us see. And thank you for all you have done, all you're doing, and all you will do for justice in the world. This magnificent institute, which bears your name, is just the latest in a long line of institutional tributes to your unique leadership. Long may it and you last. And that calls for a special tribute for the moment to the president of this university. Where is Ariel? Ariel Peratt, whom I just met 2 nights ago, but is now my best friend. Thank you for your generosity in permitting Irwin and the Cotler family to spread their wings here at Tel Aviv. I know how much this university means to them, and now that I've met you and your colleagues, I understand why. I want to talk today about a subject that has magnetized Irwin's professional interests for decades, not only because it is at the defining heart of Irwin's passion for justice, but because it is at the defining heart of the world's hope for humanity. And I'm speaking about international human rights law. I grew up thinking that international human rights law was the most important law there was. I took for granted that the majestic world order we had created after World War II would be protected by international human rights law. And I assumed that everyone else accepted its transcendental importance in protecting a global human rights consensus. Then I grew up. Now I think it's more important than ever, because the more the moral vision and consensus we codified and ratified after 1945 was eroded by expedience and exhaustion, the more it seemed to me that we needed to recommit to the legal principles that animated the Copernican legal revolution in the aftermath of World War II. More and more, I think justice, including international justice, is in crisis because more and more people have decided, like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, that the law is what they say it is. There is seemingly no more consensus about what justice means, or what democracy means, or even what law is for. We have been tolerating human rights abuses and abusers for decades, and somehow have just figured out that tolerating intolerance means that intolerance wins. How did we get here? The truth is, we let it happen by tolerating the intolerable for far too long, sacrificing principle for political pragmatism, substituting political accountability with moral lassitude, and replacing moral clarity with moral laissez-faire. Ultimately, I think we just gave up. Who are we to say democracy is better, we said? Who are we to impose human rights on those who eschew them? Who are we to insist on due process, an independent bench and bar, protection for women and minorities, a free press, freedom of expression or religion? We somehow became persuaded that humility and respect for differences required us to accept the legitimacy of regimes which did not share our views about democracy, human rights, and justice. We ignored the moral legacies of World War II. We were wrong. We may have had the rule of law, but did we have the rule of justice? We need a just rule of law, not just the rule of law. Laws and rules are important, but of what value are they if they drift or stagnate in a sea of non-compliance? So let's go back to the beginning, to the origin of the species we call modern international human rights law, not only to understand what we evolved from, but also to understand what we've evolved into. Human rights in our lifetime cannot be understood without understanding their conceptual proximity to the Holocaust. The Genocide Convention and the spiritual symboling, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversaries we celebrated last year, were the wings of the phoenix that rose from the ashes of Auschwitz and roared their outrage. They were the powerful legal symbols of a world shamefully chastened. And what lifted the phoenix and gave it power to fly was the momentum it got in 1949 from the trials at Nuremberg, which started almost 80 years ago and bore witness to Holocaust atrocities, the greatest injustice of the 20th century. Elie Wiesel said, "Nuremberg is the story of those who did the killing. Nuremberg is also the story of those who did nothing." It's quite a story about inhumanity, immorality, indifference. A story with many lessons to teach, but the past 80 years have shown how few of them the world has wanted to learn. For me, those lessons are not just theory. 3 of the European Jews who survived the Holocaust were my parents and grandmother. My parents got married in Poland on September the 3rd, 1939. My mother's family manufactured roofing materials. My father graduated with a master's in law from Jagiellonian University Law School in Krakow. He was scheduled to take his examination to qualify as a judge in Radom in October 1939. Instead, my parents spent almost 4 years in concentration camps. Their 2.5-year-old son, my brother, and my father's parents and 3 younger brothers were all killed at Treblinka. After the war, my parents went to Germany, where the Americans hired my father, who had taught himself English, to help set up the system of legal services for displaced persons in the Allied zone in southwest Germany. In an act that seems to me almost incomprehensible in its breathtaking optimism, my parents and thousands of other survivors transcended the inhumanity they'd experienced and decided to have more children. I think it was a way to fix their hearts and prove to themselves and the world that they were not broken. My formative years were spent in the shadow of the Nuremberg trials. I was born in a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany in July 1946, on July the 1st, for those Canadians in the audience, the month the prosecution summed up its case in the major war criminals trial, and came to Canada in 1950 with my parents, younger sister, and grandmother a few months after the Nuremberg trials ended. I was born at the beginning of Nuremberg, was surrounded by the survivors for whom it was created, was nurtured by parents who had somehow escaped the final Nazi verdict, and watched a father try to create a system of justice for people who didn't know such a thing could exist in Germany for Jews, all before I was 4 years old. I grew up with a passion for justice, but I have also, now that I'm grown up, developed a sadness for what has become of it, despite Nuremberg. Lawyers like me, I think, have a tendency to take some comfort, properly, in the possibility of subsequent judicial reckoning, such as occurred at Nuremberg. But is subsequent justice really an adequate substitute for justice? I don't for one moment want to suggest that the Nuremberg trials weren't important. Of course they were. They were a crucial and heroic attempt to hold the unimaginably guilty to judicial account, and they showed the world the banality of evil and the evil of indifference. But although Nuremberg represented a sincere commitment to justice, it was a commitment all too fleeting. Not for long did the prosecution of war crimes remain a magnetic national preoccupation for the Western Allies, who created it in the intimidating shadow of the Holocaust. By 1948, Britain issued a communique to the Commonwealth countries putting an end to the attempt to prosecute Nazi war crimes as a response to the recent tripartite talks about political developments in Germany. We are convinced, the British communique said, that it is now necessary to dispose of the past. The crisis in Berlin and Russia thereby turned Germany from an enemy to be restrained into a prospective ally to be recruited. By 1949, it was all over. No more Nuremberg trials, no more Nazi war crimes prosecutions anywhere in the Western world for over 2 decades, and the early release of many convicted war criminals who'd been sentenced at Nuremberg. The past was tucked away, and the moral comfort of the Nuremberg trials gave way to the amoral expedient of the Cold War. Worse, as the passion for justice faded into the passion for reconstruction, the world once again lost its compass and yielded to the seductive temptations of intolerance. Even before the decade was over, the decade that had seen the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials, Nazis were being welcomed in the West as immigrants to help design the military-industrial strategy against the new villain, communism. The Jewish victims of the old villain, fascism, on the other hand, were welcomed nowhere. Senator Joseph McCarthy revived the odor of anti-Semitism in the United States. In my own country, Canada, universities still had quotas on Jewish students. Courts upheld restrictive covenants preventing Jews from buying property. There were signs on beaches saying no Jews or dogs allowed. And as the powerful book None is Too Many searingly described, Canada closed its borders to Jewish refugees like me for years after the war. With stunning alacrity, the world abandoned what proved to be its momentary pursuit of tolerance at Nuremberg and reconstituted itself within 5 years as if neither Nuremberg nor the Holocaust had ever happened. It was a collective form of repressed memory. I never asked my parents if they took any comfort from the Nuremberg trials, which were going on for 4 of the 5 years we were in Germany, until we finally got permission from a reluctant Canada to come in 1950. I have no idea if they got any consolation from the conviction of dozens of the worst offenders. But of this, I'm sure. They would have preferred by far that the sense of outrage that inspired the Allies to establish the military tribunal of Nuremberg had been aroused many years earlier, before the events that led to the Nuremberg Tribunal ever took place. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to the 1933 Reichstag fire decree suspending whole portions of the Weimar Constitution, to the expulsion of Jewish lawyers and judges from their professions that same year, to the 1935 Nuremberg laws prohibiting social contact with Jews, or to the brutal rampage of Kristallnacht in 1938. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to any of these events, let alone all of them, would have been, at the very least, public censure. But there was no such world reaction. By the time World War II officially started, on the day my parents got married, it was too late. So for me, Nuremberg represents the failure of decent, well-meaning Western democratic nations to respond when they could have and should have to a virulent, horrifying strain of anti-Semitism in Germany in the 1930s. Millions of lives were lost because no one was sufficiently offended by the systematic destruction of every conceivable right for Jews that they felt the need for any form of response. And so the vitriolic language and venal rights abuses, unrestrained by anyone's conscience anywhere, in or out of Germany, turned into the ultimate rights abuse, genocide. Some justice did in fact emerge in the aftermath of Nuremberg, and there are many connective dots of history that we can be proud of. We've made remarkable progress in many ways, and we're immeasurably ahead of where we were in many ways. But we still have not learned the most important lesson of all, to try to prevent the abuses in the first place. We have not finished connecting history's dots. Decades later, we still have not developed an international moral culture which will not tolerate intolerance. The gaps between the values the international community articulates and the values it enforces is so wide that almost any country that wants to can push its abuses through it. No national abuser seems to worry whether there'll be a Nuremberg trial later, because usually there isn't. And in any event, by the time there is, all the damage that was sought to be done has been done. We have to recognize that the human rights abuses we've been tolerating in some parts of the world are putting the rest of the world in danger, because intolerance, the world's fastest growth industry, seeks in its hegemonic solipsism to impose its intolerant truth on others. Yet over the years, we've been incredibly reluctant as a global community to hold the intolerant countries who abuse their citizens to account. And instead, we seem to go out of our way to justify their abuse with an explanatory and exculpatory lexicon that included terms like cultural relativism, domestic sovereignty, root causes, or the most recent one, settler colonialism. In what universe can you ever justify rape or torture or hostage-taking? To paraphrase Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe may be long, but it does not always bend towards justice. And that means that too many children will never get to grow up, period, let alone in a moral universe that bends towards justice. I used to see the arc of my own life bending assertively from Nuremberg to ever-widening spheres of justice. But in this unrelenting climate of hate, I feel that hopeful arc is turning into a menacing circle. When I was younger, I thought the answer was the United Nations. The UN's charter said that the peoples of the United Nations are determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. The UN had 4 objectives: to protect future generations from war, to guard human rights, to foster universal justice, and to promote social progress. Its assigned responsibility was to establish norms of international behavior. It was our generation's designated human trajectory, and it was to be the inspiration for the world's conscience. We made a commitment to humanity then that we would protect the world from inhumanity. Since then, over 40 million people have died as a result of conflicts all over the world. I know the UN is all we have, but does that mean it's the best we can do? Nations debate, people die. Nations dissemble, people die. Nations defy, people die. We need more than the rhetorical splendor of the laws of justice. We need justice. I make these observations not because I have any particular solutions to propose, because I don't, but because I want to hear a serious conversation among people more expert than me, people who care deeply about the moral choices we make as a global community, about how to fix a status quo in which some of the worst criticisms are directed at Western democracies, what I would call low-hanging fruit, while the worst abusers barely glance over their shoulders, too busy doing whatever they want to their own citizens to care about history's judgment later. We changed the world's institutions and laws after the Second World War because they had lost their legitimacy and integrity. We may be there again, not so much because our human rights laws need changing, but because a good argument can be made that our existing global institutions, and especially the United Nations deliberative role, are playing fast and loose with their legitimacy and our integrity. It may be time to think about holding a Bretton Woods conference on human rights, or not, but we have to do something. There's no doubt that many of the United Nations agencies have achieved enormous success in a number of areas, but the UN was the institution the world set up to implement never again. Its historical tutor was the Holocaust, yet it seems hardly to have been an eager pupil. What was never supposed to happen again has, again and again. The judgment at Nuremberg was an encomium to justice. Almost 80 years later, the judgment after Nuremberg is a lament. In a world seeming so often to be on the verge of spinning out of control, can we afford to be complacent about the absence of multilateral leadership, making sure the compass stays pointed in the most rights-oriented direction? In my view, the global legal community needs to rethink the morality of its almost reflexively protective attitude towards this institutional behemoth, stop making excuses for its inexcusable and seemingly infinite patience for injustice, and start insisting that it do the job it was set up to do. My life started in a country where there had been no democracy, no rights, no justice. It created an unquenchable thirst in me for all three. It also instilled a passionate belief that those of us lucky enough to be alive and free have a particular duty to our children, to do everything possible to make the world safer for them than it was for their grandparents, so that all children, regardless of race, religion, or gender, can wear their identities with pride, in dignity, and in peace. My identity is Jewish, and I will always wear it with pride, with dignity, and I hope in peace. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Irwin and Ariella, for the great honor of it.
So I think, Justice Abella, you described in a very emoting way why fighting anti-Semitism is a personal issue for you. And I'd like to now ask Professor Shamir and Professor Cotler where it finds them. So we'll start with you, Professor Shamir.
Okay, thank you. And I just have to say that I feel humbled and honored to be with both of you on this panel. And thank you for this really wonderful speech, which touched my heart. You're asking me to share a personal anecdote. Maybe I'll share two, but they're short ones in order to illustrate where it meets me at this particular moment in my life. If we're thinking about tolerating intolerance, I think there's no question that the epicenter today of this phenomenon are campuses. This is where we're facing some of the biggest challenges with an intolerance that is often and more anti-Semitic, and that threatens to erode academia, communities, individual persons. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself and how I'm facing some of the challenges that come from this form of tolerating the intolerance. I'm a veteran, a scarred and seasoned veteran of BDS. Because my academic field is American Studies, and the American Studies Association, which is my professional organization that organizes our annual conferences and our most important publication, journal, has the dubious distinction of being the first professional organization ever to boycott Israeli scholars. And this happened in December of 2013. So for the past 11 years, I've been boycotted by my own professional organization. So when October 7th came and October 8th, and we began to see on campuses protests and letters and a rhetoric that grew very, very quickly, even before the Israeli army went into Gaza, that talked about why Israel is to actually be blamed for October 7th. I thought I was going to be able to handle it very well, since I have such experience with BDS. But the sad truth is that I didn't handle it very well, certainly not in the beginning. When I began to see more and more of my colleagues, people that whose work I've been teaching, whose work I admired, who were visitors to Israel for conferences, with whom I've had a very long professional relationship. Their names begin to appear on these petitions, and they begin to join these protests. I understood that my professional identity is over, because I'm not going to be able to have a relationship with these people ever again. And some of these petitions, for example, began to substitute the name Israel with phrases like the decade-long Zionist project of perpetual Nakba. It's a very long name for Israel. These are not people with whom I can have a relationship from this point on. And so as I was trying to grapple with everybody else around me with the consequences of October 7th, my two sons are in the army, and Maureen Adiri from the international schools got working with me on trying to figure out what to do with the 300 or 400 international students that we have on campus, and a million other challenges. One of the largest challenges for me was to understand that my professional world in American Studies is over. And it's less, I think it was less of a problem for me to recognize that for myself than it was to understand that I have much younger colleagues in many different disciplines who are now facing the same jeopardy to their professional identity, but they have their entire career in front of them. And how are they going to have meaningful careers of excellent research, which in today's world means having international collaborations, because without it, you cannot have impactful, excellent research when this is the environment, the academic environment. These are the campuses, these are the protests, this is the rhetoric that is so prevalent in our world today. So that's one anecdote. The second one came a few months later, and I'm trying to see if any of my Australian friends are here. There we go, there's Rosalie. When this time, not as an American Studies scholar, but in my current role as Vice President for International Collaborations, I traveled to Australia to make some connections with universities and also to participate in international fairs, which is where universities advertise themselves and invite students who are interested in coming to Israel to come and get some information. And I was there, we are very happy to represent Tel Aviv University along with my colleague Sharon Ziv Kafri. And it didn't go well. It didn't go well because initially the university wanted to protect us, so they put us in a building which was away from the main thoroughfare of campus where the fair was. And 3 minutes after the fair opened, a group of pro-Palestinian protesters barged into the room where we were sitting and occupied this room for the next 2 hours, shouting really anti-Semitic slogans in our ear, at the distance of, it's like Uriya's distance to me was the distance that we had with the protesters. And it was a difficult experience. Didn't make it a whole lot better, the fact that the university decided to lock the protesters in the room with us so that not to allow other people to come in and join them. I think it was from good intentions, but it meant that I had about 2 hours to engage or to try to engage with the students there. Initially, they seemed like a very nice group of young people, much like the students that we have here at Tel Aviv University. But I learned 2 things in these 2 hours. Number one, there's no talking to these students. There really isn't. It was impossible to have a conversation with them. It was impossible to persuade them that we can engage as human beings and have a conversation about the situation in the Middle East. That's number one. Number two, that the university, it was the University of Sydney, intended to do absolutely nothing about the situation. And this was the first sign for me, of which became much clearer in the next month or so, or 2 months, and what we're in the midst of now, that the universities are going to be, in some cases, playing along with the student protesters and sacrifice relations with universities like Tel Aviv University in order to appease the students. And this is something that we're facing now, and if we have time later, I'd be happy to share more of what we're doing.
Thank you. Irwin, same question.
I'm going to try and link my remarks to both what Justice Abella had to say and President Milette, that there's a kind of unifying theme here in terms of the tolerating the intolerable, Justice Abella put it, and a kind of bystander community in the campus culture. And let me begin by taking October 7th as a framework, because we meet in the continuing shadow and pain of October 7th, which has been described as the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, of mass atrocities, mass murder, rape, maiming, mutilation, burning and beheading the young and the old, the whole perpetrated by Hamas, which is not only a terrorist statelet, that would be bad enough, but an anti-Semitic, genocidal terrorist statelet, not because I say so, but because they say so, and have affirmed since 1988 in their founding charter. And I just want to say, again, in terms of the tolerating the intolerable, that the public incitement to genocide, which has been part of Hamas's founding charter since 1980, is a standing breach of the Genocide Convention, so held by our own Supreme Court of Canada, whether or not any atrocities follow. So we've seen, in effect, tolerating the intolerable since 1988 by the international bystander community. Hamas never held to account. And then we have October 7th. And one would have thought that given the horrific mass atrocities that we all painfully have witnessed, experienced, one would have thought that this would have resulted in a mitigation of anti-Semitism, that this would have resulted in an international outrage. On the contrary, what we have found since October 7th is an unprecedented international explosion of anti-Semitism. One would have thought that there would have been outrage at these horrors, particularly in the campus community. And what we are finding is there's been a kind of a silence, even support, in some instances even justification for what has been called resistance, and even at times, horrifically as it sounds, celebration. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we understand this? And what we can do about it. Let me just and the first into how one can try and it really has to do about appreciating the origin, the nature, the essence, the impact of anti-Semitism, which is not only the oldest, longest, most enduring, most lethal form of hatred, as we know, one which mutates and metastasizes over time, but it's grounded in one historical, foundational, generic, conspiratorial trope. And that's that of the Jews, the Jewish people, Israel as the Jew among the nations, as the enemy of all that is good, and the embodiment of all that is evil, reflecting whatever is the zeitgeist or the cultural norm at any given moment in time. So when it was a Christian religion, the Jews were guilty of deicide. When in the Middle Ages there was a Black Plague, then the Jews were the poisoners of the wells. When in the 70s it became human rights, when human rights emerged as the new secular religion of our time, something I celebrated then as a law professor, what we were not appreciating was that Israel then began to be seen as the geopolitical antichrist of our time, as the major human rights violator of our time. And Palestinianism, Palestinian rights, emerged as the poster child in the campus culture. And let me just, people talk about the UN General Assembly resolution of 1975, Zionism is racism. I want to tell you what happened in 1974. And it's now the 50th anniversary of a dynamic that has been repeating itself every year since then. And if we get a sense of what I'm going to describe now, and you appreciate the critical mass repeated every year since then, of the tolerating of the intolerable, and in the campus culture, all this connecting, we'll have an understanding of how we got to where we are today. So in 1974, the following occurred. Israel was held out to be the enemy of labor. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labor Organization at the time condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian trade unionism. The enemy of health. Evidence, the resolution of the World Health Organization at the time condemning Israeli, I could use the word alleged, but these things were adopted, Israeli poisoning of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. I might add that the World Health Organization has condemned Israel as the only violator of health rights in the world in the last 3 years. This is the same organization that has been producing data about what has been happening in Gaza that has been relied on by the international community. The enemy of culture. Evidence of resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of Palestinian historic sites in the West Bank and Jerusalem. The enemy of women. Evidence of resolution of the UN Commission on Status of Women condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian women's rights. Again, over the last 2 years, Israel's been held out to be the only violator of women's rights in the world. The enemy of peace. Evidence, resolutions of the UN General Assembly condemning Israel as a violator of peace. And finally, the enemy of human rights. Evidence, the resolution of the UN Human Rights Commission, as it was called then, now the UN Human Rights Council, condemning Israeli violations of human rights. And so, at one and the same time, Israel is held out to be the enemy of labor, health, culture, women, peace, and human rights. In a word, Israel, the enemy of all that is good, and the embodiment of all that is evil. This dynamic has repeated itself every year since. So consider how many generations have been exposed to it and have been internalizing it as the bystander community has indulged it, and some of us have, in fact, not only tolerated the intolerable, but have not even known that the intolerable was happening. Which brings me now to a tipping point in all this, because this process was being indulged, was being acquiesced in, etc., for the last 50 years. But let me just move to the close with what happened in 2001, the World Conference Against Racism and Hate in Durban, South Africa, which turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. And I don't want to go into it. I can tell you whenever I speak about Durban, I can still hear the chants, I can still see the marches, I can still see the demonstrations being held, as that the struggle against racism in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against racism in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. The label of Israel apartheid was born in Durban. And so let me close just by saying this. As Special Envoy combating anti-Semitism, I found two major things. One is that our conventional way of approaching the combating of anti-Semitism from the far right, the far left, radical Islam, that paradigm is still true, but it's no longer enough. What regrettably we have found has been the mainstreaming, the normalizing, the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, the popular culture, entertainment culture, the sports, and in particular, the campus culture, with the absence of outrage. That's the first thing. The second thing, and with this I close, is that democracy is not only threatening to Jews. That would be bad enough. It's threatening to our democracies. It's an assault on our common humanity. It's the canary in the mine shaft of global evil. As we've learned so painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so we have to tell the leadership of our democracies that anti-Semitism is a national security threat, not just a threat to Jews. And what we need now is a global constituency of conscience at the governmental level, parliamentary, civil society level, so that in combating anti-Semitism, we secure our democracies and defend our human rights. Thank you.
So unless I'm told otherwise, we only have 3 minutes left. And I know there are so many additional questions to broach, but since we only have 3 minutes, I know, Professor Shamir, that there's something very important you want to say about Israeli academia and where all of this meets it. So you have 2 minutes for that, so we have 1 minute for concluding remark from Justice Abella.
Well, I don't know that, I don't know if I want to say something very important about Israeli academia. I want to say that I'm very worried about the future of Israeli academia. I think that, had we had more time, I would have been able to lay out a map for you of all the different forms of boycott that we're currently experiencing. It's really on a daily basis. We get another email from a university that's severing its ties with us. We get another story of a faculty member who was disinvited to a conference. And it takes all kinds of forms, some of them institutional. I think the president talked about it yesterday in his State of the University address. Some of them are personal, some of them are overt, some of them are covert. It's a whole network of boycotts now working against us. And I think that the important thing is to see what we're doing about it. And this involves coalition building. It involves relying on our friends. We have many friends. We have, for example, the German presidents of universities in Germany who are very, very staunch allies at this moment of Israel. We have you. This is also an opportunity for me to thank all of you who've been working in your communities and also reaching out for us to try to see what you can do on campuses that you are alumni of or are close to. And it's been very effective because alongside those presidents who are friends of Israel, we have a lot of presidents who are reluctant friends of Israel, who are friends of Israel because they are being pressured to do so. And we have just one more word, a very important mission, which is to bring students here. And this is the right moment to do so. Yeah.
Good. Now let's see if you can sum up all of this in less than 60 seconds. About the mic? Sorry? Oh, yeah, I can speak some English. But the mic, you need them. Sorry.
To sum it up, am I on? Havana Gila. I would only make two quick observations because I feel honored to be on a panel with these two outstanding beacons of enlightenment. The first is, I am stunned that in a country like the United States, American studies, which considers free speech a religion, the only speech they don't tolerate is pro-Israel speech. That's number one, the hypocrisy of it. And number two, my question would be to them, if you happen to get a president you're not happy with, and the world says we're not happy with him either, we think we're going to boycott American universities and products because you can boycott professors because you don't like the government of the countries their universities are in? Hello? Nobody points out how bizarre that is. So the one thing I'm excited by on this panel is the fact that,
Common sense?
pardon?
Common sense?
No, courage. Courage. The willingness, the need to stand up and say, I don't care what you say about me, you're wrong. Criticizing Israel is anti-Semitism. You can criticize a government. These are two separate things. You can love the country and not love a government necessarily, and people have to understand that there's a difference. And when you criticize the only Jewish state in the world, that's anti-Semitism.
Thank you. So, we have to conclude here. Let's hope we meet next year in times of peace. Thank you for attending.